Hi guys, so today we are going to have a little talk about Tissue by Imtiaz Darka. So it might be an idea to have your copy of the poem in front of you, or if you're an absolute G, you'll know it well enough at this stage to be able to follow as I'm talking through. So as I have said in previous videos and several times before, a really good technique, especially for revising, is to think about the opening of the poem, the end of the poem, look at the title of the poem. You know the drill. So this poem, Tissue, opens with this image of paper, and it's paper that lets the light shine through. That's our opening, paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Now, to alter something means to change something. So we could argue really that this poem has a revolutionary tone. A revolution being a complete turnaround. In William Blake's London, we know for a fact that at the time that Blake wrote that poem, there was the French Revolution. It was going on, it had gone on, and the French people, the everyday people, your working class people, had come together and completely overthrown their government in exactly the same way, or a similar way, that Toussaint Louverture in John Agard's poem, Checking Out My History, overthrew the powers that be. I don't know if you'd call it a government, but overthrew those people who were ruling in Haiti. The slaves overthrew the leadership of the slave masters. So it's this idea of revolution. So Darka images with opens even with the image of this is what could alter things. And it's this idea, not what might alter things or what may alter things or what would or should, it's what could, which is a word that really associates with potential, having the potential to change things. So really it's a big poem when you think about it. The whole thing is metaphorical in nature, which scares some people. When I first talked about doing these videos, one of the teachers in my department sort of went, oh, please start with Tissue, because I love it. I think it's a great poem. But again, you're not going to get it until you've read the whole thing, until you've thought about it, and until you've actually considered this isn't about paper at all. So that's probably a good point to have a look at the ending. So the whole poem is full of imagery to do with paper. And when it gets to the end, we have this standalone line at the very end of the poem, which says turned. It talks about living tissue, which really, live organisms, cells, plants, human skin. Living tissue turned to your skin. Now for me, that's like the grand unveiling at the end, that really this poem's not about paper at all. It's about us. It's about the human. And the title, I think, supports that idea, because it's not called paper, it's called tissue. Living tissue turned to your skin. And once you know that, and once you get that, the poem takes on a completely different meaning when you read it, and it's actually quite easy to digest. So we'll go back to the beginning. Paper that lets the light shine through. Now, if paper really in this poem is a metaphor for us, for the human, it's this idea that as people, people who let the light shine through. Now, light imagery is something that we talk about so much. If you're revising A Christmas Carol, you're thinking about light imagery. If you're revising Romeo and Juliet, you're thinking about light imagery. This poem's no different. The emigre, filled with light imagery. Checking Out My History, John Agard, again, light imagery used throughout the whole thing. So paper that lets the light shine through. What is the light? Typically in literature, light can represent hope, goodness, kindness, even the love of God or the godlike quality. So paper, people who let their light shine, who let the light and the goodness shine through. This is what could alter things, change things. Now, in terms of power, really, this poem is quite revolutionary. If you look at poems such as Ozymandias, for example, we get these traditional forms of power, this tyrant king, this leader of Egypt, the mocking, the sneering. And yet here in Darka's poem, she talks about paper that's smoothed and stroked. Again, paper being a metaphor to the human. This idea that if we as humans smooth and stroke and, nurture, essentially, humankind, we spread that kindness and that softness, that actually this is where our true power comes from. The idea that we are soft, we are vulnerable, we are like paper, we're fragile. But actually, she gives us the image of placing layer over layer, script over luminous script. A really lovely image there. Now, if you go to the shop and you buy tissue to blow your nose or toilet tissue, realistically, you will get tissue 2-ply, thin sheet of tissue, thin sheet of tissue, 3-ply, thin sheet of tissue, thin sheet of tissue, thin sheet of tissue. The more plies, the softer it will be. Quite often, the more that you will pay for it. So how do we apply that to this poem? Place layer over layer. The idea that I'm a layer, you're a layer, someone, your next door neighbour's a layer. Each of us is like thin tissue, soft, fragile, tearable. But actually, if we place layer over layer, try it, you get some tissue paper, layer, 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 layer. You try and rip it, it won't rip. It's this idea of unity as humans, that we come together, layer over layer for strength, script over luminous script. The adjective luminous, again, we've got this idea of letting our light shine. It adds on to the light imagery. So it's this idea of unity of the human race, standing together. Perhaps much like in William Blake's London, the government didn't want people standing together. You've got this idea of the mind-forged manacles, the blackening church, the terror, really. The government were terrified. What if the people realised their strength and their power? What if they came together like the French just had to completely overthrow us? Where will we be then? That fear in Ozymandias, king of kings, mocking and sneering and cold command, keeping people in their place. And yet here we have this idea that there's strength within us. Now, if you look sort of as you go down the page, if you're looking at tissue on the page, you get this reference a bit further down where Darker says maps to. Now, obviously, maps also, now we have G-maps, we're in a technological age, but maps typically, traditionally, were, again, on paper. So you get the paper image, but she says maps too. The sun shines through their borderlines. Well, what do borderlines represent? Separation. You know, Spain, Portugal, Scotland, England. This idea that borders separate us. But actually, the sun doesn't discriminate. The sun shines through those borderlines. It's again promoting that unity between people. What could the sun represent? Goodness, love. Love doesn't discriminate. The love of God doesn't discriminate. It's another assertion of the strength of humankind when we stand together. So the sun shines through, not on, not across, but through. It's quite a powerful image there. Again, this idea of breaking through, of altering things, of maybe changing the world. And again, as we go through, a really cool part of the poem, I think, is when she references buildings. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. This idea that I feel, to me anyway, buildings can be representative of those typical power structures. You think the Houses of Parliament, you know, you've got Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plot. Buildings represent power. Ozymandias, in Shelley's poem, put up this colossal structure, this huge, intimidating structure to assert and enforce his power. It's built to last. But Darker gives us this idea, well, if buildings were paper, if typical power embodied these power structures and governments, if they embodied the softness of paper, the fragility of paper, the vulnerable nature of paper, paper that's transparent, smoothed and stroked to be transparent. And Darker repeats that. Have a look at the poem, this idea of smoothing and stroking paper, of nurturing and being gentle. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift and see how easily they fall away on a sigh. This idea that actually they're not as strong as they appear to be. Their power, just like in Blake's London, the power's up here. It's this idea of getting people to forge their own chains, the mind-forged manacles, that all we need to do is place layer over layer, script over luminous script to come together and we will recognize our strength and we'll recognize our power. So if you want to go a bit deeper on that structurally, it's quite interesting and rhythmically. She says, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. And you have the rhyming there of drift and shift. It's very subtle, but it's kind of this idea of finding a rhythm that maybe here in the poem, here we're actually onto something of finding a rhythm, of changing the world, of living more gently. If you look at the history of kind of the world and the culture that we live in, it's quite barbaric. You know, the amount of wars that have gone on, all you have to do is Google how many years in the existence of the United States of America that country has been at war on some level. And it's this idea of revolution, this idea of actually letting the light shine through. This is what could alter things. I'm not going to go on for much longer, but the idea of buildings is extended by Darker, where she talks again with the light imagery about letting the daylight break. Have a look. Let the daylight break through. Again, it's through, I believe. I'm doing all this from memory as well. Through capitals and monoliths. Again, capitals, monolithic structures. Let the daylight, the kindness, the goodness, let the daylight break through. Think about that for a minute. A breakthrough. Is this poem about a breakthrough? Changing the way we think about things. Break through the capitals and monoliths. It's almost quite I wouldn't quite say aggressive, but forceful image, breaking through something. Let's break through these traditional forms of power. Let's shatter it. Viva la revolution. It's that kind of thing. Let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. And she tells us that an architect could use all this and never wish to build with brick or block. Brick and block, again, quite strong, quite hard, quite unbending, quite unmoving. Never wish to build with brick or block again. That actually it's our softness, it's our gentleness, it's our kindness that gives us strength. So the image that I'll leave you with is when Darker talks about the building of a grand design. Now that does have quite religious connotations, this idea of the grand design being the human. It's arguably a bit arrogant to think that as humans we are the grand design, that we're sort of above other forms and other species. But this idea of a grand design, clearly that's about the design of a human and the building of a structure not meant to last. Now again, I think we have clear links with Ozymandias here, the idea that this colossal structure was built to last. And we all know what happened. Time, nature, the sands, the erosion, the decay, the shattered visage in the sand. This idea, well, that it can't last. But Darker's point here is that, yeah, you know, the grand design is a structure, it's us, not meant to last. And that's fine. That's where our fragility lies, but that is essentially our power. And the lovely reference where she talks about pages of the Quran, whom was born to whom, on which sepia dates. I think that's quite interesting because it's this idea of who was born to who, that we can use paper and we can write down who was born to who came into the world, who died. It's this cycle of life. And there's things that we can pass down. Light, love, kindness, all of those things can be passed down and they will last. They will stand the test of time. That sneering and mocking and coldness, all those typical harsh forms of power, all those things that buildings represent, all those shapes, this is a quotation from the poem also, shapes that pride can make. I mean, how powerful is that? This idea that pride essentially is what built that colossal statue of Ozymandias and essentially left it as a wreck. So there's lots in there. I hope that's been helpful in terms of revision. I'm aware that I've talked about quite a lot of references within the poem. Again, in an exam scenario, depending on the question, depending on what you wish to compare the poem to, your knowledge of it, my knowledge of it, is going to be far greater than what you actually write about in an exam scenario. But I think it is important to have the whole picture and understanding of the whole poem to go on. So in terms of comparisons, I think Ozymandias is an obvious one. We've talked about some parallels with Blake's London in there. Just remember that ultimately you're free to make the comparisons that you want to make. As long as you're making clear comparisons for the 5, detailed, thoughtful comparisons for the 6 to the 7, compelling and convincing comparisons. As long as you're thinking comparatively the whole way through, you're analysing language, the images, you're looking at structure, I think you're pretty much safe. So again, I hope that's been useful. Watch this space. I'm going to prioritise over the coming week getting quite a few of the other poems covered. So do watch this space. Do feel free to ask questions if there's anything that you'd like clarity on. And yeah, I hope that your Easter's going well, and I hope that your revision's going well. Watch this space. Speak to you soon. Bye.